Hello, my name is Helen Moseley and I work for CAFOD's campaigns team. CAFOD is the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. We were set up by the Bishops' Conference many, many years ago to work with impoverished communities all around the world. In this very special Jubilee year, we're focusing on the theme of managing debt. There is a new global debt crisis. It is affecting very many low-income countries around the world. And it's actually a catastrophe. It's reaching very, very severe levels and it's having an enormous impact on ordinary people, on our brothers and sisters who are living around the world. And it's something that people don't really know about. People aren't really hearing about it. And we know in the Jubilee year that we look back through scripture and back through biblical times for inspiration of what the Jubilee themes mean and how we can interpret them in this year of 2025. And we know that the Bible teaches us that lending money to people in biblical times was about accompanying vulnerable people when they need help, walking alongside people to help them with resources, to help them get back on their feet. But that isn't how lending money is in our modern world. It's too often about profiteering and about people who already have the money making more money from people and countries at their most vulnerable time. So this year, as we are inspired by our Jubilee themes, we look at this new global debt crisis through that lens and understand that there are 54 countries in the world who are struggling under the burden of unpayable debt. And it's meaning that governments are having to fund huge repayments to banks and institutions and governments in the richer countries and therefore are having to hugely neglect their own public services. We're finding that countries are spending huge amounts channeling money to northern banks in the global north, as we say. And it means that schools and hospitals, which are already desperately underfunded, are having very little, sent in the way of budgets. It means that sewage systems and coping with droughts and coping with floods and all of these things that low-income countries have to cope with, all of these things are suffering because so much money is being sent to pay back these debts. So many people will ask, well, how did this situation come about? How do these countries owe so much money? And of course, all countries borrow money. That's part of the global financial system. But the roots of this crisis go back to around 2008 with the global financial crash, where wealthy banks and hedge funds saw an opportunity to make money by lending to low-income countries at very high interest rates. There have been global shocks since, such as the war in Ukraine and the COVID pandemic, that have all contributed to this complex situation, but it means ultimately that countries are in this very, very difficult situation with no way out. People say, well, shouldn't debts just be repaid? If you borrow money, you need to pay it back. And of course, there's some truth in that. But these countries aren't just paying back the money that they borrowed. They're paying it back many, many times over because of sky-high interest rates. So we consider the principle of debts being repaid, but we look at the human cost. And it's the human cost that we're focusing on this year because of the impact that this is having in terms of the cost of living reaching sky-high levels in countries where people already can't afford food, where hospitals are going without medicines, schools are going without teachers, transport costs are tripling. We hear from our partners in Kenya, in Sri Lanka, in Sierra Leone, who all have stories to tell us about how this is impacting people and how a sort of economic issue that sounds so complex and complicated is actually having an impact at that level of the ordinary family, day in, day out. So in this Jubilee year, we're calling for action on this debt crisis because there are very practical things that governments can do in order to address this and to make the situation more manageable. Many of us will remember the Jubilee 2000 campaign that happened at the turn of the millennium and the last Jubilee year and ask, didn't we solve this problem at that time? Why is there a new debt crisis? And it's a really good question. Jubilee 2000, which saw people from all over the world uniting, there were 22 million people signed a petition calling on rich governments to cancel unpayable debts of low-income countries leading up to the year 2000. And it was an incredibly successful campaign. It resulted in about $130 billion worth of debt cancellation for 36 of the world's poorest countries who had on average 3/4 of their debts cancelled as a result of that. And the money was ring-fenced to go into public services, into health and education. And as a result of that, the number of children completing primary school in those countries on average increased from around 45% to 66% over the 20-year period. So history shows us that when debts are cancelled in this way, there can be a tremendous benefit for ordinary people. And Jubilee 2000 was incredible in terms of what it achieved. But unfortunately, despite the efforts of that campaign, there was no long-term reform done to the systems, the global financial systems that led to that crisis in the first place, which is how we've ended up back here. And that's where a critical part of what CAFOD is calling for this year is for longer term reforms so that we can't keep ending up back in the same situation with debt crises. But also, of course, we need urgent action now to tackle the situation that is currently happening. We need debt cancellation, some debt cancellation for some of these countries, and we need a better system for global money lending that means countries can't be exploited in this same way and end up with this crippling debt burdens. So there's lots of action that's needed, and it's certainly within the powers of world leaders and governments to take action on this crisis. So we're taking our inspiration from this Jubilee year and calling on them to do something about this so that ordinary people's lives can be made easier. Pope Francis has spoken a lot about this crisis over the previous year when he was talking about preparations for the year of Jubilee, and then when the Jubilee year began in December, Pope Francis has spoken explicitly about this debt crisis, calling for action on it in the Jubilee year. He actually talked about, he said, another heartfelt appeal that I would make in the light of the coming Jubilee is to the more affluent nations. I ask that they acknowledge the gravity of some of their past decisions and determine to forgive the debts of countries that will never be able to repay them. And he said, really critically, more than a question of generosity, this is a matter of justice. So in this Jubilee year, we would invite parishes all across England and Wales and in the Archdiocese to join us in this campaign and invite parishioners in your parish to take part in this by signing the Global Church Petition and calling for action on this debt crisis in the Jubilee year. So in Eastertide, we will be sharing this petition with parishes, and it's a perfect time, isn't it, of new hope and of new beginnings where we could call for change for our sisters and brothers around the world who are feeling the impacts of this debt crisis so severely. So look out for that at that time, for the petition that's being shared with Catholic parishes and other organisations and other partners all around the world over this Jubilee year. Look out for your opportunity to take part and add your voice to this because it's so important. So a common question that people ask is, what about corruption? How do we know that if there is debt cancellation that the money will be used properly for public services? And indeed our partner organisations in these countries tell us that government accountability and transparency is something they're calling for all the time, and it's really important. So in this Jubilee year, CAFOD is working with many partners around the world, our sister organisations in the Caritas network and other partner organisations in the UK, such as Christian Aid and Save the Children. So join us, add your voice to this call for debt justice in the Jubilee year, and together we can make a noise about this, and ordinary people can come together and stand side by side with our sisters and brothers around the world and call for something to be done on this in order for human beings to live happier, more healthy lives.